All right, page 51, we're talking about inheritance. So we talked about DNA last class. We talked about genes. We talked about heredity. And now we're going to continue to talk about hereditable traits, that is, things that are passed down from generation to generation. Inheritance is sort of the title of this little bit. So there are often different versions of a gene. So versions is your blank there in your notes. Different versions of a gene. One from one parent and another from the other. These versions of genes are called alleles. Alleles, okay? A-L-L-E-L-E-S. So dominant traits. We're going to talk about dominant traits and recessive traits. So what are they? Well, dominant traits, when gametes unite, information from one parent may be dominant over the information from the other parent for the same characteristic. The dominant trait is expressed in the offspring. So, for example, if your parents, let's say, have very different, hairlines or very different, earlobes, right? We talked about that the other day, the connected or the attached or the not attached. If they have very different characteristics, okay, and you can't have both, you're going to have one or the other, okay? And that comes often, guys, pay attention. Where's your notes? Okay, no. So there, it's a good point in that sometimes your parents have two different color eyes, let's say, okay? So one parent is a green and one parent is blue. You could have like a hazel or something that's a mixture of both. That's totally fine. Dominant traits are usually one expressed over the other, not necessarily a mixture of the two, let's say. So let's continue talking about the dominant traits here. The dominant trait, if one is dominant and one is recessive is the other name, then the dominant one will be expressed in the offspring. Even though the offspring has the information for the other trait, it is not expressed. So if you have a parent, let's say, that has very curly hair, and you have another parent that has very straight hair, okay? As we're going to learn here, curly hair is a dominant trait. So if you have two parents that have curly hair, you might think there's no chance for the offspring, for the kids, to have anything but curly hair, but that's not actually true. Because if your parents both have curly hair, they could have the dominant curly hair trait, that's true, but they actually could pass on two recessive traits to you, which means that you wouldn't have curly hair. So I'll explain that more in detail in a second. But the other kind of trait that is not dominant is called recessive. So let's talk about that here real quick. Recessive traits, recessive. Now, recess means taking a break, doing something different, right? Go outside and play, recess. Or, we don't really have recess in high school. You have a 5-minute break, let's say. It's not really a recess where you just go outside and play like you did in elementary school. But if you think of like recess, it means to pull back from. So if you have a recess at school, you're pulling back from your studies and you're going to go outside and you're going to just relax for 10 or 15 minutes. So recessive, to recess, means to pull back from. So these traits are kind of like a secondary pulling back from the dominant trait. So an individual may have genetic information for a trait that is not observed. That is not, here you're going to fill in not. The genes that are not expressed in the individual would be recessive traits from recessive genes. Okay? So we have lots of information in our genetic code, but not all of that information will be expressed on the outward appearance, right? Or what actually comes out and makes us kind of who we are, what we look like, how we behave, how we're built, that sort of thing. Okay, so unfortunately your notes are black and white, so this is going to be a little tough. You're going to have to, if you have some crayons or some different colored pens, you're going to probably want to adjust a little bit in your notes here. So you can't really tell in your notes, the black and white notes, what's blue and what's brown. But Punnett squares, they are a graphical way of showing traits of offspring of two parents. So you've probably heard of these before, maybe you've seen these before, but this is sort of how these dominant and recessive traits can be passed down to offspring. So you have a picture of this, And what's happening here in this little diagram, in this Punnett square, is we have here, this is brown. So let me just write this up here because you might have a tough time seeing that. This is brown eye, and this is another brown eye, okay? So we have two parents that have brown eyes. In these particular parents, okay, which you wouldn't realize just by looking at them, you wouldn't know if they have a recessive blue-eyed trait. So the capital B is the dominant brown-eyed trait, okay? So brown eyes are dominant, and the capital B is for brown eyes. So one allele from one parent. Okay, guys, what are you doing? Everybody ready to go here? Pay attention, please. One allele from one parent had the dominant brown. One allele from the other parent, in this case, had the recessive blue. Okay, so a small letter is a recessive gene, or a recessive allele, let's say. And the capital letter is the dominant. So in both cases, these parents were like hybrids. Okay, they were hybrid in this trait. So a dominant gene and a recessive gene. Okay, so if that's the case, they both have brown eyes, but their children, you will see that most of their kids will probably have brown eyes as well. But there is a chance that one child could have blue eyes. All right? So this is how this works. In a Punnett square, the intersecting row and column would have the letters, you know, of that row or that column. So this is a capital B, capital B. So there is 1 out of 4 chance that the offspring or the child here could have two dominant brown-eyed alleles. So a capital B and a capital B. So obviously that person would have brown eyes, and they would have two dominant genes. There's a chance of 2 out of 4. Okay, so this one is a capital B, little b. This one is also a capital B, little b. 2 of these children would probably have brown eyes, but they would have a recessive blue trait. And so that's when you see, let's say, families that, you know, everybody has brown eyes except for one person. Okay, or you see that grandpa and grandma have, one of them has blue eyes, and all the children, you know, have brown eyes, except there's a couple grandkids that have blue eyes. It's like, wow, where did all this come from? This is amazing. But this is kind of how this works. So one child here, okay, this 1 out of 4 chance. Now there's a 1 out of 4 chance, and this resets with every offspring, right? So there's a 25% chance that 2 brown-eyed people, if they have a dominant and recessive trait each, they could produce a blue-eyed offspring, okay, or a child. But that's a 1 out of 4 chance, okay? Now, if you have the second option here is if you have a brown-eyed parent over here. So again, this is, so you can see this in your notes. That's brown, and this is blue over here, a blue-eyed parent, okay? Then again, the blue-eyed parent must have 2 recessive genes here, okay, because their eyes are blue. My eyes are blue. So I am obviously like this person right here. I have 2 recessive blue genes, okay? So my mom has blue eyes, my dad has brown eyes, and so this is like sort of my situation with my mom and my dad, okay? And so I was one of these 2, okay? So there's a 50% chance that I was going to have blue eyes or brown eyes, okay? Now my sisters, oh boy, as the test here. I think 2 have brown and 2 of us have blue. There's 4 in my family, and I think that was 50-50. I think 2 have brown and 2 have blue. So that's how it worked. It worked out kind of 50-50. All right. Now the third one, you might want to add this. We're going to add this. I've got one set up for curly hair. We'll do that later. Let's do. So if this might be obvious, but if you have blue eyes, that means that we have little b's everywhere. And if you have 2 parents that have blue eyes, legit blue eyes, and we won't talk about the other colors just right now, but blue versus brown, let's say. So if you have 2 parents with blue eyes, okay, there's pretty much no chance that any of their children will have brown eyes, because having blue eyes means that you have two recessive genes. So guess what? All of the offspring will look like this. There'll be small b's all over the place. All right? And this ends up being what happens in populations, okay? So if you think about it, in certain areas of the world, you have a lot of people with similar characteristics. And let's say in certain areas of the world, you have lots of blonde-haired, blue-eyed people, like let's say Sweden or the Nordic countries up there. Well, there just happens to be a lot of couples and a lot of generations of couples that sort of like do not have the brown dominant trait in their genetics. And so a lot of the children, if the blue eyes marry and have kids, their children will have blue eyes as well. So if someone with brown eyes comes in and marries somebody with blue eyes and has a kid, well, then you could have the brown eyes come back into the population, right? But where similar looking people or similar built people have offspring, their offspring have a greater chance of having those similar characteristics. Does that make sense? Okay? And it's almost always a loss of information here. You're not gaining anything new. You're culling out or you're removing bits of this diverse genetic information when stuff like this happens, as you can tell. Okay? Question? So in this example here, yeah, the question was 2 people with brown eyes, couldn't they have a blue-eyed child? That was the first example that we looked at right here. Yes. Now, if the parents, both of them have like large, like capital B, capital B, capital B, capital B, if they both have dominant brown-eyed traits, then their children will not have blue eyes. They will all be capital Bs, kind of like a purebred sort of, pure, no recessive trait there, and then their offspring will all be brown, and that dominant trait will most likely be passed on to more and more offspring, and that's how that kind of happens too. Yeah, another question?
So are blue eyes always trait?
Yeah, no, blue eyes are, okay, so here's some examples of dominant traits, and yeah, they don't really flip. It doesn't really flip like that, no. Blue eyes wouldn't become a dominant trait necessarily. So examples of dominant traits, yeah. So curly hair is dominant over straight hair. Baldness is a dominant trait. I'm not too happy about that one. Having a widow's peak, so that's like a V-shaped hairline in the front. That is dominant over. Freckles are also a dominant trait. A cleft chin, you know what a cleft chin is? That's like the kind of the crease in the middle, the vertical crease in the middle of your chin there. The chin, yeah, cleft chin. Dimples, you have dimples on your face. That's also a dominant trait. Okay. Okay, so in this little example here, guys, let's not. In this little example here, I have one parent that has the dominant curly hair trait with a recessive, and I put a little C, but you could change that to like straight, a little S if you want. I don't care. Maybe that's a little bit easier to understand. So a small lowercase s. So this is parent 1 here, and this is parent 2 here. They both have curly hair, okay? So they both have curly hair. This child is going to have curly hair for sure. They're going to have 2 dominant curly hair traits or genes there. And so this, if this is the offspring that's actually produced, and again, this is, a chance. It's a 1 out of the 4 for this one. Then this individual here will have dominant curly hair, and all of his or her offspring will have curly hair because they're passing on one of these capital C's, and that's going to dominate. Over here, we've got a capital C and a little s for straight. This is a capital C and a little s, and this is 2 little s's. All right? So if you think about this, now, in my situation, so my wife and I both have curly hair. Now, I don't have much hair anymore, but when I was your age, my hair was very curly. And my wife's hair was extremely tight curls. So we both have curly hair. Yeah, you can see some pictures of me from my high school days up there. Long, curly hockey hair. Absolutely. So this was most likely us right here. Now, I don't know for sure. I think we're kind of like this, okay? If we think back to our families, most of our siblings have curly hair. I don't know if all of them have curly hair on my wife's side, but I think some have curly hair, and there's like levels of curliness. It's tough to tell. There's a lot of environmental factors into this, right? Nutrition and all this sort of stuff too. But anyways, so most of my kids have curly hair, which makes sense, okay? And I would actually say that probably one child out of the 4 has straight hair. So this is pretty much, so for first child, right? First child, these are the chances. 1 out of 4 chance that have straight hair, 3 out of 4 chance, 75% chance that my firstborn son would have curly hair. When he was young, his hair was poker straight, like very straight, but it's quite curly now. So there's different hormones that can activate this kind of stuff, and puberty affects things. So when you're young, when you're a baby, you may have blonde hair and then turn out to have really dark brown hair when you're an adult. Stuff like that. Or straight hair when you're a baby and then it curls up at puberty. Something like that. So there's lots of complications going there. But I would say probably my third daughter has pretty straight hair. Like, she does not have curly hair. She would probably be this one right here, so she has straight hair. Now, if you have straight hair, and I would almost say that straight hair is a little more common than curly hair, but it seems that these dominant curly hair traits have been, I guess, bred out of the population, maybe in this area of the world. And there's lots of curly hairs other places, but this sort of dominant trait has been, it seems that there's not a lot of curly-haired people, even though it's a dominant trait. Now, the levels of curliness actually is affected by, you know what makes your hair curly? It's the sulfur in your hair, actually. So it does have to do with diet and your nutrition and stuff like that. So you could have really curly hair, or you could have just a slight curly hair, or your hair could even appear to be pretty straight, but you could still have this curly gene. So there's other things that contribute. All right? Any questions about dominant or recessive traits here? Punnett squares, anything we've looked at in the first half hour here? Any questions there? Okay. Okay, so again, this gives us kind of an idea of what the chances are that offspring could have certain traits given if we know the alleles of the parents. Okay, so these are called Punnett squares, and yeah, we can do some tests, and you can check in your textbook too. There's different examples. Okay, so somebody asked about green eyes here. We have in this picture here, so we have some blue eyes, we have brown eyes, and we have like looking like green eyes maybe over here. So brown eyes is most dominant. Boys in the back, hey, bring that up here, please. I don't know why you got that back there. Brown eyes are the most dominant, then it's green eyes, then it's blue eyes, is what it looks like here, okay? So my wife technically has green eyes. My wife has green eyes. I would say, I think 3, oh boy. I think 3 of my kids have blue eyes, 1 has green eyes. So, it's you never really know kind of what you're going to get, but that's how green eyes sort of fit into the mix. And I don't know if there's really any other colors that we need to talk about, but there could be, there's variation within these colors too, right? Some very dark brown, some real light brown. As a matter of fact, to be honest with my daughter, it's like every time we look at her eyes, it's like, do you have blue eyes or green eyes? Like, it's really tough to tell. So there can be sort of an expression of these traits that's a bit of a mixture too. I don't really know how it all works, but anyways, that's where green eyes fit in. Page 58 talks about genetic modification. All right, so obviously you can read in your textbook a few pages in between there, but page 58 is the start of section 2.3, and it's titled Genetics, Technology, Society, and the Environment. We're going to talk a little bit about this, but there are some things that I'm going to get you guys to study because there's a lot of different things related to this subject. So what is genetic modification? Well, scientists alter genes of many different organisms in order to improve would be your blank there, in order to improve their survival or use in society. Okay? So if we're talking about, longer fur for animals so they can survive colder climates, if we're talking about larger animals or livestock that are harvested for the meat that we eat, there's different influences, different alterations, and a lot of it's through selective breeding, but there are genetic alterations or modifications that can be made straight to the genes as well that would change organisms in a way. Okay. So influencing the genetics of agricultural crops. have made plants more resistant to cold, to disease, and to drought, for example. Pay attention. Okay? Fill in these blanks. Selective breeding in animals matches desirable traits of parents to produce offspring with desirable traits of both. So again, this is the selective breeding we're talking about. If you have an animal that has, desirable traits for whatever, whether it's a pet or whether it's a work animal or whether it's for an animal for food or whether it's some plant that is pretty, has pretty flowers or whatever, then if you breed that with another parent that has, similar traits or another desirable trait, then you can get offspring that have both, okay? So that's a way to modify the genes without actually trying to go into the cell and changing things. So you can't really go into a DNA strand and pluck things out and rearrange things, but you can do this by selective breeding. So obviously there are ethical questions regarding genetically modifying living things. Can you think of any possible issues? Okay, so let's pause and let's just discuss for a moment what possible issues might arise in this sort of process. Okay? Yep.
Like you said, there's like apps that like if you have two different people, like you can post.
Yeah.
But like with selective breeding, you might just have like two things that are just like
Okay, so not getting the desirable traits that you want to end up with is a real possibility. The question is, I want you to think about this. The question is, what are the ethical implications? Are there any issues ethically? So ethically means would there be any part of this this whole concept that you could think might be morally wrong, that might not be ethical? So ethical means, pertaining to ethics or morality or right and wrong. Yeah.
like, for example, if you create.
Right. Very good point. What if you're breeding dogs and you get something that some offspring that you really like, but because this is some kind of almost extreme sort of breeding with two very different kind of dogs, you get something that's like a detrimental trait, like they have trouble breathing or their bone structure is really bad, right? Or they are susceptible to disease, they get sick all the time, right? So you're basically trying to force the creation of this new breed or this different breed, and what you're doing by doing that might be compounding some mutations or errors in their genetic code to make the expression of that very, very bad. So you're right. That obviously, so what do you do with that, if it's a dog or something like that is having trouble breathing, and you've done this, it's not going to have much of a life, right? So you may be generating something that's pretty detrimental to the organism, right? Very, very good. That's perfect. Yeah. Others? Okay, so in a sense, you're taking over a natural process and imposing your will on something that's supposed to be a natural process, right? You're saying. So where this kind of reproduction may or may not happen naturally, with us sort of forcing this to happen. I mean, if maybe ethics is like, should we be forcing this to happen? And yeah, if this would not normally happen in nature, but we're trying to coach it along or trying to impose our will on this, is that, a natural kind of thing, and is that right for us to do? That's a very good question. I don't have answers to all these questions, but these are great questions that you guys have, so I appreciate that. Did you have a question over there or a thought?
I was gonna say the same thing as Lucas.
Yeah, so another good point. I mean, obviously, you're saying obviously we wouldn't do this with humans, right? Put them in a cage until they sexually reproduce, and then just to see what would happen, right? So, I mean, is that right with animals if we wouldn't do it with humans? And yeah, I would say that's a very good point, that we would not do that with humans. That would be ethically wrong to, force, sexual breeding in humans to now, in the lab, this happens in the lab like in a test tube, right? I mean, you take an egg from a female and a sperm from a male. This happens. It's called in vitro fertilization, where they actually unite these gametes to create, basically living organisms in the lab. So that's a question as well. Like, is that okay? You're not forcing two people together, but you're taking, these gametes and uniting them in the lab. And what happens after that? So there's a lot of moral and ethical questions around that as well, because lots of times there's many eggs and many sperm, and you never know what's going to happen and what you end up keeping and what you end up discarding. And so when we talk about those kind of ethical issues, then that's a real serious discussion as well, right? So that comes back to that, when does life start? That comes back to, how much should we be playing God, so to speak, in these situations, right? So very good questions. Okay, so moving to the last section here, guys. In your textbook, there's a whole section on accidental changes in DNA. Now, when we talk about carcinogens, what are carcinogens? What does overexposure to the sun cause? What is male infertility? What is breast cancer, color blindness, hemophilia? So what I want you to do, mainly from your textbook, okay, I want you to look up on pages 64 to 67. I want you to make your own notes, okay, on these topics right here. So it's a bit of independent study here right now for the rest of the class. And I want you to write on what you can learn about what are carcinogens, what effect do they have, how do they change the DNA, and this sort of thing. So do your own little research on here. I guess I would expect that when you're done this, you should have a brief summary of what they are, what they do, in order for you to study and learn and memorize and to get to know that. So we'll talk about this again when you're done working through this. But from your textbook, page 64 to 67, you can go ahead and make your own notes on these things right here. All right, so when you're done identifying and explaining the changes here, so research, I think in your notes I'm a little more detailed here than this, but research and explain the effects of each of these. So what are they and how do they affect your DNA? When you're done those part of your notes, these are the questions at the end of chapter 2 that we'll be looking at. So page 74, you can take a moment to jot those questions down in your notes as well. And they are right there.
Are they?
They're not due tomorrow. Nope. You can jot those down.